Let's get started. First, I know some of you from my precept, but it's nice to be able to parachute in and have a little bit of time with the rest of you for this little guest lecture. As you can see, we're going to be talking about environmental activism today and civil disobedience. So just to sort of set the stage, right, the organizing theme of the course, right, is this thorny nexus of environmental problems, right, climate, food, water, biodiversity. And especially in the moral philosophy section, what we're trying to do is basically show or highlight, right, a bunch of the ways in which our social, political, economic institutions, our behavior and forms of life, how they're wildly at odds with the moral values that are at play, right? And so part of the goal of this is to try to figure out how you all, right, in the course of the rest of your life, right, what this means for you and how you engage as citizens in your careers, in your politics, in your consumer behavior, right? So the core component of this class raises a bunch of questions about how you ought to respond, right? And one of the sort of pioneering leaders in civil disobedience, Henry David Thoreau in 1849 in his essay on civil disobedience, says something to the effect of, right, he's in jail protesting a poll tax around the Mexican-American War. And he's like, look, there are thousands of people who are opposed in opinion, right? And very few who take action to put an end to injustice. Right? And so in the last couple of classes over the maybe last week and a half or so, in some of the other lectures, you've started treading some of this ground, right? So in Professor Constantino's class, you started talking a little bit about this distinction between individual responsibility and collective responsibility. Things like, what kind of personal behavior might you change, go vegan, fly less, et cetera, to reduce your sort of emissions or your ecological footprint. And then on the other side, these like bigger structural, systemic, institutional kinds of responsibilities and changes that are required. And then in Professor Nixon's lectures in the last couple of days, particularly this week, right, you've raised the idea of civil disobedience, the sort of revival of civic agency, intersectional activism, alliance building, social movements, et cetera, right? And so today, what I want to do is basically take a kind of slightly more philosophical lens into these kinds of issues and focus on various forms of political action and activism that one might consider taking or engaging in order to force systemic changes, right? So in some ways, I think of this class as the kind of bridge between the individual responsibility questions and the collective responsibility questions, because on the individual side, it's not all about changing your consumer behavior, right? Or these sort of like ways of reducing your emissions or changing your footprints, et cetera, but about contributing to, participating in systemic, structural, institutional change, right? There's a political form of action that you can take as an individual to tackle some of the systemic issues. And of course, there are many different forms of these, of actions, activism, protest, ways of participating in a movement, in building the right kinds of institutions, in protesting the wrong kinds of institutions. And of course, many of them are legal, totally above board. And today, though, what I want to do is focus on the sort of boundaries of permissible forms of engagement. So including some potentially illegal forms of activism. Okay, this is a little bit of setup. So consider a case of direct action, actually a couple of cases of direct action. So these are pictures of two groups. On the left, a group of activists that broke in October of 2016, broke into a bunch of pipeline sites that are transporting tar sands oil from Canada into the United States. They broke into sites in Washington and Montana and Minnesota and North Dakota. So Enbridge sites, Keystone, Kinder Morgan sites. They cut the locks off the emergency valves, the emergency shutoff valves, to manually turn the valves and shut off oil flow through the pipelines. Right. On the right side, another case of a very similar kind of action in Minnesota for a couple of Enbridge's pipelines in February of 2019, where similar group of individuals broke in, cut the locks, et cetera. Right. Before they did this action, they called the pipeline operators to let them know they were about to do it. So that potentially the companies could shut down remotely the oil flow, right? They waited around to be arrested. They filmed it, so they weren't trying to do this secretly or covertly or anything. But of course, in so doing, right, they were charged and convicted. Some of the sentencing is a little bit more complicated, but for various forms of sabotage, burglary, criminal mischief, conspiracy, trespassing, critical infrastructure crimes, a huge bevy of criminal charges, right? And cases went through the court. We can talk about them a little bit later, but for now, I'm just going to sort of put this out there as an example. But as motivation for engaging in this kind of behavior, they'll say things like, look, since politicians didn't act, we did, right? And they take a kind of necessity line, like this is something that has to be done in order to protect the environment. So Dan on the right here, he describes the extraction of the tar sands as an ongoing atrocity, right? That he refused to stand by in silence, right? Alison Pullman described it as an act of grief at the state of violence in the world and an act of celebration of the beauty of the earth, right? So, okay, I want you to kind of have this case in the background throughout the rest of the lecture today. As we proceed. And here's what we're ultimately going to try to do, right? The goals for today are basically threefold. First, to probe the boundaries of permissible forms of environmental activism. Second, to understand the concept of civil disobedience, understand its contours and component parts. And then third, assess the prospect of more radical, potentially less civil, forms of environmental activism and disobedience, right? So civil disobedience is supposed to have this kind of privileged status as a form of lawbreaking and protest. So we want to interrogate that and then see whether there are other forms that are also justifiable. Sound okay? And there'll be a couple of moments where hopefully we'll do a little bit of interaction. It'll be a little bit less lecture-y than some of the others. So I'll let you know when we get there. So to start, I want to ask basically two orienting questions. The first is a reflection in some ways on this case, but also other cases you might be thinking about, is whether it's permissible to break the law in order to protest environmental injustice, right? So I'm going to ask you this, and we're going to do a little survey. So let me see if I can actually make this work. I mean, the question is phrased in terms of permissibility, but also in terms of the case that I just laid out, like, might it even be required or necessary to engage in law-breaking action to protest environmental injustice? So let me see if I can, where's my mouse? Okay. So take your clickers and is this, what do I have to do? Select. And I want you to answer this question. Is this going to do what I want? A is yes, B is no. We'll do that. Okay, so A is yes, B is no. Okay, just take another 10 seconds. We're gonna go through this kind of quickly. I just want to get a sort of a really quick gauge. Okay, I'm gonna show the results. Okay. It was a little bit split, but 84% of you, yes, at least in some forms is permissible. So of that 84%, does anybody think it actually might be required? Did I click stop? No, I didn't. Dropping a little bit. Okay, there we go. 81%, 82% now. So of those that think it's permissible, does anybody think it might be required of us as individual actors to engage in this kind of behavior? Yeah, Rosemary, yes. Do you want to venture? Go for it, yeah. Mm. Cool. Okay, so morality, legality don't line up, right? In order to defend morality, which I'm guessing based on your response, we might think is sort of has primacy or is more authoritative with respect to guiding our action. Well, so sometimes we have to break the law, go against the law in order to defend morality. And this is a way of defending morality. Okay. So I'm curious, those of you that said no, why not? Why isn't this permissible? There are a few of you. Is anybody bold enough to venture their thoughts? Not, it's okay. We can move on because I've got another question. We're going to sort of talk about this as we go along, but the kinds of reasons one might answer yes, the kinds of reasons one might answer no. So, but I do want to ask you a second question, right? Which is, Oh no, sorry. Yeah, there we go. So whether you personally would ever consider engaging in protest activity that could risk your arrest in defense of environmental justice. So if you follow Rosemary's line, like, look, sometimes this is justifiable, but then there's a separate question about whether you would ever consider doing it, right? And so I'm curious to see if anybody hide the results. Boom. This will work. Just take another 10 seconds or so. Okay, I'm going to stop it in 5 seconds. The last results, get them in. Okay. Interesting. So we start seeing some movement, right? And now it's like a little bit above 50% in favor, yes, and 46% no. So this is interesting, right? And so I'm curious if anybody wants to share why, right? So if yes, if you answered yes, when, why, in what circumstances, right? And if you answered no, why not? Like, what are the reasons you would say, like, look, particularly those of you that answered yes in favor of it's being permissible, right? Maybe required, who knows what you think. But then your sort of personal action, it's like, I don't know if this is for me. Like, not sure if this is for me. I'd be curious about that. Does anybody have thoughts about their response to this one? Yeah. Okay. Cool. Okay. Yeah. So this is partly looking at a sort of privileged status, right? You think you might have. So look, I'm actually in a place where I could take on and bear some of the costs. And if that is effective, if it communicates the right kind of message, right, then maybe that's something that, like, I'm in a very different place than somebody that's much more vulnerable to abuse, right? Already disadvantaged, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, maybe this is a way of using that kind of privilege. Okay, great. Anybody else want to share their thoughts on this kind of question? I mean, obviously it's like a big existential kind of question, right? The thought of going to jail, the thought of suffering potentially very serious consequences for engaging in environmental action is not a small thing to be considering. So yeah. 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 Okay, good. Yeah. So the thought is like, right, you might be able to make a little bit of a difference, but there's also a huge opportunity cost in being in jail, that you can't be a continual member of the protest movement. And right, cost benefit on the whole, just keep me involved, keep me involved, keep me involved. And that's going to be much harder if I'm locked up in jail. I mean, is this true if you just take some action that's only, the sentence is only going to be a couple of days? So some of these valve turners actually ended up getting a couple of days. One of them, I think, got a couple of years. Some of them were just let off completely. So if it were that, if it's like, look, I have to sort of accept the night in jail, the 2 nights in jail, the 2 weeks, the 30 days of community service, does that change things a little bit? And you're only thinking in terms of, I mean, they could have faced 20, 26 years. So if you're facing that cost benefit analysis starts looking really big, right? Cool. Okay. Yeah, go for it. Okay. Yeah. 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 So the costs to you are very significant, right? It's not just a night in jail, potentially, right? This is something that then you have to, right, in states that don't have the ban in the box, you have to like put on every application. It's something that will stick with you potentially. Now, you might always have a good explanation, and maybe your employers are going to say, okay, there was civil disobedience action, so it's more justifiable than sort of ordinary offenses, but right, it's big, that's real. Good. It's worth thinking about these kinds of things, right? What other alternatives you might engage in? What are the kind of costs, right? Whether you think you could actually make a difference. We're going to talk about all of this later. Whether or not there's a movement that you're aligned with, or you're just a sort of sole individual actor. Yeah, did you want to jump in? Yeah. 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 So we have to take into consideration the whole picture for ourselves and for the efficaciousness of whatever action we think we're engaging in, and with respect to its long-term consequences. Cool. Good. Okay, so I think I'm going to move on for a second. There will be another point later where we'll come back to some of these questions, right? So the point of doing this is partly to just motivate. How do I then make this disappear by clicking the blue fancy cloud? Okay, is that there's a longstanding tradition of civil disobedience, right? That's going to answer the first question affirmatively under a set of stringent conditions, right? With a similarly long legacy across the globe, right, of people facing severe legal punishment for their protests, right? I mean, even this last year, like hundreds of protesters up in Minnesota have been arrested in a very sort of militarized enforcement, protesting the construction of Enbridge Line 3, right? So you've probably seen or maybe seen some of this in the news, right? It's happening here, it's happening across the globe always, and people are suffering very serious consequences. Okay, that's all by way of kind of setup. But as we start thinking about civil disobedience, what are we actually talking about, right? At its most basic in principle, right, civil disobedience is basically a form of law breaking in protest of unjust laws, policy, or conduct, right? But in addition to that, it's performed in a way that can claim moral authority, right, and still express fidelity to the rule of law, right, or even sometimes people will say this. So Martin Luther King says this. He's sort of one of the foremost champions in history of civil disobedience. That it's a way of expressing the highest respect for law, right? The rule of law and democratic discourse, right? So you have this kind of goal, but then you also have this constraint on methods, and the constraint on method is trying to claim a kind of moral authority in the way that you're breaking the law, right? So of course, figuring out what this actually means requires distinguishing between just laws and unjust laws. And in some ways, through the rest of the course, we're trying to figure out some of the problems that would identify what count as just laws or institutions or conduct, right? With respect to climate, with respect to food sovereignty, with respect to water resources and access, with respect to land use policy and biodiversity, like all of these sorts of issues. That's kind of what we're trying to do. We're not always putting it in the language of just or unjust, but that's what we're kind of trying to do, right? And I'm not going to fill that story out today. King, who I just mentioned, right, when he starts talking about this in some of the work you've maybe read, his letter from a Birmingham jail, right, he talks about distinguishing just and unjust laws in a bunch of different ways, but some of them are like, right, the unjust laws are in disharmony with the moral law, going back to Rosemary's original point, right, or they're laws that degrade human personality, or that are compelled on the minority by the majority that doesn't bind themselves by those same laws, or they're inflicted on a minority who have no part in enacting them or writing them, right? So there's a bunch of different ways we can think about this, but we have to figure out that picture ultimately, sort of structurally thinking through what we're doing, right? And once we do that, understanding this kind of goal, the target of civil disobedience, is going to help us distinguish it from other kinds of ordinary law breaking, right? Ordinary offenses, we'll call them, where if I just like steal something from the grocery store, it's very different than when I'm breaking the law in order to protest unjust laws, right? Okay. And that's the thing that's going to underwrite its claim to being in service of authoritative, legitimate, justified law, right? It's by saying, look, the law's out of whack with morality. I do care about the rule of law, but I care about it being actually legitimate and not these bad ones that I'm protesting, right? And it's also what's going to help us distinguish, in virtue of its law breaking, right, civil disobedience from ordinary protest that's within the boundaries of the law, right? If I'm just standing on the street side with a placard, like I'm protesting, but I'm not engaging in civil disobedience because I'm not breaking the law. Okay. Now, on the other side, understanding the kinds of constraints on methods, so the second point, is what's going to help us distinguish civil disobedience, right, from other kinds of law breaking, right? Law breaking that's done more secretly, more violently, more coercively, more aggressively, right, more militantly. And so going back to Martin Luther King's telling of civil disobedience, right? Civil disobedience break the law openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. So with the rest of today, what I'm going to do is kind of work through some philosophical exploration around these kinds of constraints on method. We're going to kind of lay them out and then continue our discussion from there. How are we doing so far? Everybody following? We're good? Cool. So civil disobedience usually is pitched with 5 sort of standard central elements. And the first is that it be undertaken conscientiously, right? That it's done, it's got to be principled, right? It's not flippant or opportunistic in the way that we might think of sort of forms of looting or rioting, right? That it comes from a kind of serious, sincere moral conviction, right? That the breach of law in some sense is demanded by one's sense of self-respect, sense of decency, moral consistency, or the interests of society, right? The psychological experience of engaging in civil disobedience is that it's not just permissible, but it's actually required. It's demanded of oneself. It's necessary, right? Okay. So that's one sort of the core elements. Second element is that the law breaking in civil disobedience is meant to, it's intended to serve a communicative function. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean, it's a way of conveying one's condemnation, right, of the policy, the law, right, the conduct, right, and drawing attention to the reasons one has to complain about it, right, the reasons you would offer that it's morally indefensible. Okay. That it's communicative in this way. It's meant as a kind of contribution to democratic exchange or discourse, a way of exchanging reasons publicly, collectively, deliberatively, right? And in doing that, it's a way of shedding light on neglected issues that are left off of the agenda and putting them on the agenda, right? And a way of trying to force one's opponent to defend themselves, right? Who sometimes, as a matter of position of power or whatever, they don't have to, and they're sort of sitting, right, able to continue the law or policy or regime without being scrutinized. And this is a way of forcing that scrutiny, right? So, I mean, as such, it's actually meant as a way of kind of demonstrating civic virtue or responsibility, because these are the kinds of values that we think are important for civil, democratic, deliberative exchange, right? Okay. Now, of course, it's important to be interpretable to others, right? When you're communicating through your actions. So Professor Nixon has talked a lot about symbol, and in the civil disobedience space, symbol is important, right? What you do matters. What you do communicates certain things, right? And it interfaces with what you do. What you communicate interfaces with what you do, right? So sometimes people will make a distinction between direct civil disobedience and indirect civil disobedience, where on the direct civil disobedience side, you breach a law that is the law that you oppose. So think of the civil rights movement. If you oppose segregationist law, you might do a lunch counter sit-in, right? And say, look, I don't like the segregationist law. I'm going to break the segregationist law. Now, in environmental activism, oftentimes you don't have a problem in principle with the kind of law, right? So you break into the pipeline facility, right? And you don't have a problem with trespassing law or property law in general, right? But you're doing that, you're breaking that law indirectly to communicate something else. Does this make sense? This sort of distinction? Good. So you don't oppose that law directly, but you're using it to demonstrate, to communicate something else. So if you trespass a fracking site, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. In addition, civil disobedience is often taken to that it has to be done publicly, right? It can't be done covertly or secretively, right? It has to be committed publicly, openly, and so John Rawls says this, with fair notice to the legal authorities, right? So I mentioned this in the valve turning case, that they called the companies and said, look, here's what we're going to do. We're giving you warning, right? Now, the reason why this is usually thought to be a sort of essential part of the civil part of civil disobedience is that it's a way of kind of showing good faith engagement with the authorities, with your interlocutors, with your opponents, right? And in addition, it can help control your messaging and the uptake of your action, right? If you give people warning, so listen, this is what we're going to do, it helps you shape the messaging and branding of the action, right? Now, that said, of course, sometimes secrecy is essential to your strategy, right? So if you're an animal rights activist and you're very worried about experimentation on animals, right? If you give warning that you're going to break into a research facility and let out the animals being researched on, right? They're going to stop you, right? They're going to protect it with militarized force, and you're probably not going to be able to do it, right? So, I mean, that raises a sort of question whether or not this should cast doubt, this possibility that secrecy is sometimes essential to the strategy, that it casts doubt on like the publicity constraint as being essential to the justification for the activism you're engaging in, right? Or maybe it just narrows the range of cases that count as civil disobedience. No, it's really important for civil disobedience that it be done publicly. But then there are maybe some other forms of justifiable protest that aren't necessarily public, that are more secret. And we can justify those too, but they're not civil disobedience. So there are two sort of things that are going on. There's one, the conceptual categorization of like what falls under the umbrella of civil disobedience. And then two, what are justifiable or permissible forms of intervention, of direct action, of protest. Does that make sense? And then of course, right, maybe you can take a balance and say, well, look, maybe it can count as civil disobedience as long as you claim the action afterwards and express your reasons for doing so, even if you don't do it necessarily in advance. Maybe that can still satisfy the publicity constraint, right? These are all things I want you to be kind of thinking about, right? Okay. Fourth, and in some ways is perhaps definitionally true of civil disobedience, that it be done non-violently, right? Otherwise, it would just become uncivil disobedience, right? So it's partly this definitional point, but also there are principled and pragmatic reasons people offer in favor of non-violent action, right? So first, it's a way of sort of recognizing one's adversaries and bystanders, right, who you're trying to minimize harm to, as moral equals that are deserving of respect, right? It's not degrading them, dehumanizing them. It's treating them as moral equals that deserve respect. And it's often refusing access to the same violence that one's adversary feels entitled to use on you. It's a way of expressing respect for democratic discourse, which we tend to think democratic discourse is done through reason giving, not through force, not through violence. And it's also pragmatically valuable, right? It's a way of gaining allies, decreasing backlash, reaching consensus, or also reaching people's conscience. Nonviolence has sort of theoretically and in practice, a way of drawing attention and gaining sympathy and reaching people, right? Persuading people from across the aisle because they see the amount you're willing to suffer. They see your seriousness in a way that it's much easier to dismiss, disregard, vilify when action is done violently. And there's been some political science research. I'm not going to talk about this that much, but in the last couple of years, a really good book by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stepan about the comparative success of nonviolent action compared to violent action. Now, a lot of that research is done on like anti-regime, secession movements, anti-occupation movements, and less so at the level of individual civil disobedient actions or protest actions. But at the same time, they compare a bunch of, it's like 323 different cases from 1900 to 2006, and they find that it's significantly more than nonviolence is more than twice as likely to succeed, way more likely to end up with democratic results than militarized and armed conflict. So, I mean, that's one thing to be thinking about with respect to the outcomes, with respect to the likelihood of success of one's protest action, to be thinking about is the political science on violence versus nonviolence. But specifying the scope of violence is actually kind of difficult. So what counts as something as being violent or not, right? So does violence to the self count, right? If I engage in a hunger strike, I'm doing a lot of harm to myself. Now we might think does that count as violence? Not. I can consent to it, right? It's my decision. The psychological violence, right? So if I sort of, terrorize psychologically, if I belittle, if I demean my opponent, does that count? Or does it have to be physical violence, right? Does violence to property count in the same way violence to persons would count? Or could I destroy your bulldozer as long as I don't destroy or harm your person, right? Do threats of violence count? If I'm not engaging in actual violence, but I'm threatening it, right? Does minor or accidental violence to others count, right? Does turn your action into non-civil disobedience because somehow, does self-defensive violence count, right? There's a bunch of things to think about. Particularly because sometimes nonviolent actions can be just as harmful as violent actions, right? So if you're an ambulance workers and you go on strike, that's a nonviolent action, sort of in principle, but could potentially do a lot of harm by not having people, access to emergency services, right? So the categories are interesting to be thinking about from the moral point of view. And at the same time, targeted violence might serve some of the other goals of civil disobedience, right? It might help communicate your seriousness. It might gather attention. I mean, in principle, maybe it will gather enough attention to gain allies. But of course, once we start thinking about this, we really have to think about the potential direct and indirect harms from any violence, the risk of antagonizing any of our opponents, the risk of alienating allies or potential supporters, right? But it's worth thinking about, okay? Finally, we're at the last, fifth and final sort of standard feature of civil disobedience, which is, the thought is that it's incompatible with resisting or evading arrest or punishment, right? It's a way of sort of demonstrating one's seriousness and moral purity and respect for the rule of law, that you accept the punishment. So they waited, right? The valve turners waited there to be arrested. They didn't do it and then flee. Okay. It's a way of sort of saying, I don't deserve this, right? But I'm going to accept the punishment just to show you how virtuous I am, right? Just to show you how morally serious I am, just to show you how serious this injustice is. And in part, it also might have sort of strategic and symbolic value as well, right? Turning the costs on yourself, right, rather than inflicting them on others, right? It's harder to see you as a terrorist or as a vandal. Now, of course, and if you want to read about this, Will Potter's got a good book called Green is the New Red, about efforts to brand environmental activists as eco-terrorists, right? So it's not clear that just being willing to accept the penalty actually succeeds in this, but it might help a little bit. And at the same time, also, you'll see some in the public discussions about this is people being branded as attention seekers, right? So the messaging is very hard to control, but the thought is that it might have some strategic value as well, right? Now, on the other hand, so I don't know your name, but this is what you mentioned at the beginning of class, right? Being willing to accept the penalties might just by itself, right? It might reinforce an injustice because it takes you out of the fight, right? It might, especially if you're a sort of vulnerable, oppressed member of the community already that's suffering injustice that you're trying to protest, it might exact a huge personal penalty, right? It might prevent you from future work. So this is the point we raised earlier, and right, set back the cause. So it's important to be thinking, like, how important could this possibly be if it's this counterproductive and costly, right? Why should we be bound by unjust laws, right? That don't have authority. That's the whole point, is we're protesting unjust laws that aren't authoritative. So right, how important could this possibly be? This is a thing that we want to be thinking about. And in any event, similar to on the nonviolent side, we're going to need to require an account of what willingness to accept the punishment consists in, right? You have to make it easy for the authorities. Is being willing conditional on the guarantee of a fair trial count as being willing to accept the punishment? And if I don't think I'm going to get a fair trial, I'll say, no, screw you. Like, you don't get to run a sham trial. Is it incompatible with mounting a vigorous defense in court? Now, I mean, half the battle of these civil disobedience efforts is to be able to mount a sort of necessity claim in court and say, look, I had to do this. This was the last resort, et cetera. So this is the thing that we want to be thinking about as well. How are we doing on time? Okay. So together, whoops, sorry. Together, these constraints on form and on method of protest, they're meant to be the things that earn civil disobedience a kind of particular moral authority as a means of protesting injustice, right? Partly this is in spite of its lawbreaking compared to legal alternatives, and partly because its approach to lawbreaking compared to other forms of lawbreaking, right? Compared to the more militant ones, compared to the more violent ones. So, whoops, I don't want to do that quite yet. So I'm curious, just after sort of laying out these conditions, civil disobedience, if anybody that was resistant to accepting the permissibility of breaking the law in order to protest is persuaded and say, well, okay, maybe under these circumstances, if it's this constrained, maybe that's an acceptable form of breaking the law. Anybody moved? That was part of this, whatever, 15, 16, 17%. Okay, if not. Okay, it's all right. Anybody moved in the opposite direction? No, I guess not. Usually if you're sort of on board from the beginning, then you see this and it sort of builds out the case rather than would undermine the case. So, okay. With this on board, what I want to do is ask two more questions, right? Is there anything else that you would want to know in order to evaluate a case of law breaking in defense of environmental justice? Like, what else would you need to know besides knowing that somebody met all these conditions of civil disobedience? Is there anything else, or is that sufficient to knowing that the protest was permissible? Is there anything else that you'd be curious to know about? Yeah, go for it. Cool, because like the actual thing that they're protesting, maybe the magnitude of its harms, maybe its urgency, how drastic the problem is. And if you're doing really drastic protests in protest of a very small problem, maybe this is disproportionate in some sense. Good. Anybody else? I mean, would you want to know things about like what alternatives you've taken? Is this your last resort, right? Would you want to know about the likelihood of success? Because that's not built into the conditions. If you follow all the conditions, but you don't think the protest is going to be very likely to succeed, might that undermine its justification, right? What if you were alone disobedient? Would you need to be in coordination with others? That's not an element, but that might be important for justifying the protest action. There are a range of other things you might think about. And then at the same time, the next question, think about is, right, whether or not there might be forms of law breaking that don't meet these conditions, but that are nonetheless still justified, right? So more along the covert, militant, violent, secretive lines. And that's what I want to turn to. So in our last, say, 10 minutes, I'm going to start taking a look at less than civil disobedience, right? And whether or not there might be a case to justify it. So here you've got some pictures of a bunch of different things. Sea Shepherd is an organization that you might have heard of that sort of will sometimes ram whaling vessels in order to try to protect whales from being hunted and killed. Monkey Wrench Gang on the left is a famous book by Edward Abbey about this idea of monkey wrenching or eco-sabotaging, basically like tinkering, destroying so that you can see the picture, destroying a bulldozer in order that you prevent logging from happening or destruction of some environment. So that you got two pictures here. On the bottom left is a tree spiker, all right, where you go in to a forest, drive some big long spikes into trees, call the logging company and say, hey, look, we spiked the trees. And it ends up being, it's very dangerous for loggers to go in then and log because they don't know which ones have spikes in them. If they go and run their chainsaw into a spike in a tree, right, can cause a lot of harm. So this is a more sort of threat of violence, maybe violence directly to the tree, but threat of violence to the loggers. Bottom right is a sort of way of destroying the air filter of machinery to try and like jam the gears of environmental destruction. The right's just a book on eco-defense. So what are the kinds of things that might push beyond civil forms of disobedience? Is there anything that anybody might be compelled to think, as maybe I wouldn't do it again, but it would maybe be justifiable to sort of push the boundaries? And any reasons why this might be the case? So if the magnitude of the environmental harm is important, what if it's really, really, really bad? Existential, catastrophic, urgent. Is there a way in which cranking up the stakes might justify more violent action? Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, so this is really pushing on this line. Like, if you've finished all your alternatives, if this is really the last resort, like, look, you're not listening to me in all the civil forms. What else do I have in my basket? I can't accept the injustice. So you've left me with no choice, and here we go. Now, are you thinking also that then we would need to sort of scale it up? So start with the, non-violent to persons, but violent to property, or the threats of violence, and then escalate up. And then is there a point where you get to physical violence to persons? Like, you don't know? Okay, it's a hard question, right? Yeah, go for it. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, so like everybody in this room is going to suffer from some toxic gas, but if I can like hit somebody in the head, knock it out of their hands, protect you all, like if it's my only way, shouldn't I do it? Right? It's just kind of, again, cost benefit analysis. Going to be particularly effective, or it's the only way to solve the problem. This seems like this can potentially be a justification, right? Or causing some harm to prevent further harm. Yeah. 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 Good. And this is actually a kind of thing that the valve turners that we started will talk about, right? They're all middle class, relatively privileged. And they say, look, this is our opportunity to basically use it. And the environmental movement itself is like, it's controversial, a little bit torn on these, even the climate movement. Partly about whether or not it's going to be effective or alienate people or let you be branded as terrorists and pollute the message, et cetera. But the thought is like, for them, their specific explicit justification was, we're in a privileged position to be able to do this. Ends up getting complicated, but this is worth thinking about. Any other thoughts or any problems with potentially escalating? Do you think, why would you be nervous about this? Go for it. Yeah. Good. Good. And so, yeah, this is sort of worry about a slippery slope a little bit that you get on. You can justify it in the valve turner case, but it takes on its own kind of logic. And you might, without the critical, intervention to give you pause, might start accepting more and more radical, more and more drastic action. And slowly but surely, you sort of find yourself doing something that's right, bomb threat or something, and very, very unjustifiable. And you're like, wait, how did we get there? Because there's not a feedback mechanism to sort of stop the logic once it starts running. This is a worry. Any other kind of concerns? Yeah, go for it. Hmm. Okay, good. And just to sort of throw out the question, I mean, what kind of evidence would you need one way or another about the likelihood of success, right? Cost benefit analysis of like, is this actually going to make a difference? Is it actually going to stop the gears of progress? Or is it going to just delay them, cause blowback? Like, what kind of evidentiary standard would you need to use in order to justify moving from civil to non-civil disobedience? You don't actually have to have an answer to this, but again, it's worth thinking about, right? How strong your justification would have to be, because it's also easy to sort of talk yourself into thinking this one's going to be the one that solves the problem, right? When it's not clear that that's usually going to be the case, right? On the civil side or the non-civil side. I will just say, so for Edward Abbey, it was very important for him to maintain a distinction between what he called terrorism and what he called sabotage, monkey wrenching, eco-sabotage, right? So I'll just read you a little quote. Terrorism means deadly violence for a political and or economic purpose. It's carried out by people and other living things, and this little needle is usually conducted by governments against their own citizens or by corporate entities. Sabotage, on the other thing, which is the non-civil form that he endorses, means the application of force against inanimate property, such as machinery, right, which is being used to deprive human beings of their rightful work. So at least in some of the characters that have, sort of been in some sense champions of these more non-civil methods, right, they really, really want to maintain this distinction between harm to individuals, to humans, to persons, and destruction, intervention, violence to property. Okay, I want to end with basically two arguments, and we're just going to see what they do. Two arguments for more militant action. So the first one, I'll go really quickly because I know we've just got 2 minutes. So first one is basically this. The requirements to express fidelity to the rule of law and abide by democratic norms are stronger the closer to conditions of justice that you are. Our laws and institutions are fundamentally anthropocentric, right? They're worried only about human beings, not the rest of nature, and non-democratic at the level of species. And we could add with respect to global justice. This is an argument that I'm taking from Ned Hedinger, who's an environmental ethicist, retired now. Right? Our laws are fundamentally anthropocentric. As such, actions in defense of species-level democracy or global justice and representation are less bound by existing human-centered laws and democratic norms, right? Which, as we just said, operate wholly illegitimately from the species level, from the global justice level. That's an argument. You can recognize the form. What implications might that have for more militant strategies, right? Could this help justify more militant strategies, right? Or is anybody skeptical of the impact of this kind of argument, right? I mean, if it's still less effective, if it still backfires, you might think, well, we should still be pursuing alternative strategies. Worth thinking about. Now, with our last minute, one more argument is offered by David Brower, the first executive director of the Sierra Club, right? He says this kind of thing. It's like, more militant strategies are a way of shifting the Overton window, right? So the people that are easily named extreme make the people who were extreme seem suddenly more reasonable, right? So it goes to this sort of logical progression. The Sierra Club made the Nature Conservancy look reasonable. I founded Friends of Earth to make the Sierra Club look reasonable. Then I founded Earth Island Institute to make Friends of the Earth look reasonable. And then Earth First is now making us look reasonable. We're still waiting for someone else to come along and make Earth First look reasonable. So there's another kind of argument, say, like, maybe it's important to have this as an element, as a wing of the environmental movement. At the same time, maybe this is unconvincing. Maybe it's like, yeah, that only works up to a point. And then beyond that, it's counterproductive to have this kind of wing of your movement. I think that's our time. So thank you and enjoy your weekend.